Bill Hayton, The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia. Enter the labyrinth of the South China Sea, an intricate battlefield of sovereignty, military power, and contrasting economic realities. In Bill Hayton's The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, readers are invited to explore the region's complexities, the historical ownership disputes among China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and the political tremors that emerge from their battle over these tiny islands. Unearth the truth behind Chinese propaganda, the harsh conditions faced by soldiers, and the myth of oil reserves in this area that remains at the center of world trade and potential conflict.
Contradictions in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a case study in contradictions, where small islands with no valid cultural or legal claims trigger military and diplomatic showdowns. Despite the lack of obvious economic or strategic value, the area has seen rare shooting battles that claimed Vietnamese and U.S. troops' lives. China uses strong-arm tactics to claim control of the area, with pushback from surrounding governments and private sector participants from the US and Europe. Historical evidence indicates that no modern power can accurately claim to have discovered the islands of the South China Sea. However, China shapes the debate as the mightiest party in the area. The situation in the South China Sea is more complicated than in the Black Sea or the Caribbean because of the numbers of rocks, islands, and claimants involved. The history of the disputed Spratly Islands. The Spratly Islands in the South China Sea were named after Captain Richard Spratly, a British whale hunter, and were initially used for mining bird droppings. The islands contain no value and were not occupied after World War II until the Philippines claimed ownership. In 1947, China drew a U-shaped line to claim territory in the South China Sea, including the Spratly Islands. Taiwan occupied the largest island in 1956, while Malaysia controls Swallow Reef for profit as a diving resort. The imperfect accounts of the South China Sea. The territorial debate over the South China Sea is largely shaped by imperfect accounts from 1974 Chinese Communist Party journals. Despite their flaws, these accounts are still relied on by Western writers and continue to influence the political situation. In 1974, China seized the Paracel Islands while Vietnam was at war. The U.S. was unable to stop the invasion, and a naval battle ensued between the Chinese and Vietnamese forces. Despite the bloodshed, oil companies like BP continued to view the situation as just another joint venture, ignoring the sovereignty dispute. The flawed historical accounts of the Paracel Islands have had lasting effects on the region, showing the importance of accurate and thorough reporting in shaping political outcomes. China's expansionist agenda. China's territorial ambitions extended beyond its mainland and reached neighboring countries. In a bid to strengthen its claims and control over the South China Sea, China created an artificial island on Fiery Cross Reef in 1988, which angered Vietnam, leading to several conflicts and increasing anti-China sentiments. The country's aggressive stance continued with building oil platforms on Mischief Reef in 1995, deepening tensions with the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. China's neighbors saw it as a significant threat to their sovereignty and security, with Singapore's Prime Minister likening it to a dog marking its territory. Despite international pressure, China persisted in its expansion, showcasing its geopolitical power. South China Sea disputes. The South China Sea is a focal point for international conflict, with China claiming ownership of the majority of the region and its resources. In 2009, China submitted a map to the UN, marking the first official declaration of its vision for the area. The so-called U-shaped line is a staple of Chinese propaganda and appears on Chinese passports. Rare public protests occurred in Vietnam in 2007 and 2012, with demonstrators protesting Chinese aggression, and wearing shirts displaying a map of the U-shaped line crossed out with an X. The South China Sea is a critical hub for global commerce, and political tensions continue to escalate as neighboring countries dispute China's claims. Despite protests and opposition from other nations, China is still asserting its ownership over the majority of the region, including areas that neighboring countries claim. As territorial issues in the South China Sea remain unresolved, the region continues to be a center of international conflict. The South China Sea oil rush. Despite extensive efforts to monopolize fishing and oil drilling base building, China has failed in the South China Sea. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, ventures including Crestone Energy and British Petroleum tried, but failed, to find significant oil deposits. Randall Thompson, the head of Crestone Energy, sold 70% of his South China Sea oil exploration rights to BP, who only found a disappointing quantity of oil. The U.S. lifted its embargo against Vietnam in 1994, making the region more attractive to oil companies. Thompson paid $50,000 to the Chinese government to explore 21,000 square kilometers of sea 250 kilometers from the Vietnamese coast. He was part of an oil rush as U.S. oil companies also jumped into the South China Sea. However, while the Chinese Navy offered to protect his company, a Vietnamese boat fired a shot across the bow, and China also blockaded a joint Russian-Vietnamese oil rig. Thompson eventually sold Crestone for $15 million, whose primary asset was the Chinese contract to explore Vietnam-claimed territory, but no oil was found. Meanwhile, some observers suggest that China's claim to the South China Sea is nothing but a strategic bluff in an effort to get a seat at the table and impress global audiences. China's quest for energy in the South China Sea. The South China Sea, which potentially holds 11 billion barrels of oil and 4 billion barrels of natural gas, is a vital source of energy for China. However, Vietnam's successful drilling in the area has posed a problem for China. The Chinese government has used various tactics, including threatening foreign companies like BP, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, CGG Veritas, and Talisman, to end their partnerships with Vietnam. Moreover, China claims only a small part of the South China Sea but devours 3 billion barrels of oil and 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas annually. With the current consumption rate, the energy reserves in the South China Sea may only slake China's thirst for a few years. As a result, China continues to push its boundaries in the area, while Vietnam has been fortifying its presence. There's a likelihood that such activities could lead to further confrontations between the countries, as seen in their tension over the Paracel Islands in 2014. Challenging oil reserves in South China Sea. Despite China's efforts to control the South China Sea, experts remain doubtful of significant oil reserves due to geological factors like porous reef formations and typhoons. China's historical claim of the U-shaped border surrounding the South China Sea has ingrained a cultural and political myth that helps assert dominance and distract from domestic issues. However, oil experts are skeptical of the region's potential, citing the hampering effects of typhoons and less promising geology than other oil-rich regions like the Gulf of Mexico, Western Australia, and East Africa. Geologists search for underground rock formations to find reservoirs that can ultimately pool oil reserves, but the South China Sea's reefs prove too porous for long-term storage of oil. Even the sea's deepest parts have no hydrocarbon potential, according to one expert.
The South China Sea remains a convoluted tapestry of territorial claims, historical uncertainties, and political maneuvering. Although the true value of these contested islands and atolls may be unclear, what is evident is the growing tension between China and its neighbors as they vie for power in the region. Serving as both a stage of influence and a distraction from domestic affairs, the South China Sea will continue to be a hotspot of potential conflict as the struggle for dominance persists. Readers are left with a vivid understanding of the intricate, multi-layered struggle for power in a region that has become an emblem of global tensions.